Professor Michael Levitt works at Stanford Medicine, where he is a biophysicist and a professor of structural biology. In 2013, Michael Levitt received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, together with Martin Karplus and Aryeh Warshel, for the development of multi-scale models for complex chemical systems. Professor Levitt obviously knows far more than I do about science and medicine. Welcome to Outsiders, Professor Levitt.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Now, you've been right on top of the entire COVID story right from the beginning. To say you've been sceptical about some of the measures would be, I think, fair. Tell us about, now we're 6 months into this, tell us basically your initial concerns about the coronavirus, how it's played out, and basically how it has shown you to be right all along.
So basically, I got involved in Corona because my wife is a curator of Chinese art, and we spend a little bit of time each year in Shanghai. When the outbreak started there, we were very concerned for our friends, so we sort of reached out to them and said, you know, we're with you. We didn't know it was going to be okay. And then I started to look at the data, and the first thing I saw is that the epidemic in China was very bad in one place, in Wuhan, but actually quite mild everywhere else. The death rate in Wuhan was around 3 or 4%, whereas in the rest of China it was around 1/10 of that. So that was one part of the good news. The other thing is it seemed like the virus was growing with brakes on, and in the sense that it never really seemed to double. I mean, everyone talks about this exponential doubling, and this virus at no point ever seems to double. I mean, you can always say things have increased by 10% and then maybe 10% again later, but if the time it takes to get the second 10% keeps on increasing, then you're not really increasing exponentially. You need to basically, like a bank, pay yourself 10% interest every single day. So those two things gave me some cause for hope. I wrote reports to the Chinese don't have very good access to internet, and just simply sending out PDF files or posting PDF files into their WeChat. And then towards maybe 3 weeks after I started, towards the last week of February, I looked at the Diamond Princess and saw that in a situation where very high population density, everyone's getting infected, the infection seems to stop at around 20%, and the infection fatality ratio is around 0.3 or 0.4%. So those very beginnings made me feel that this epidemic, was probably more severe than flu. I think back then I said it was 2 or 3 times more severe than flu. I have better estimates now, and that it was actually going to be easy to control. Now, we then had the outbreaks in Iran and Italy and the enormous panic we were seeing from northern Italy. But then looking at things, they settled down. And basically, if you look at all the data, and literally I look at the data for all the world, but in Europe where there's very good data, plus everyone would agree there's been a lot of death and epidemic in Europe with Italy and Belgium and Britain and France all having pretty high death rates. The overall death rate in Europe is about 40% more than the flu from 2017-18. So it's worse than flu, at least. But remember, for flu, we have a vaccine. Flu occurs in the winter, when in general there are more deaths, so it's easy to absorb those excess deaths. Probably the best strategy, and this is not one which has been taken by almost any country worldwide, is basically treat it like a flu. And the important thing about flu is not that it isn't a terribly bad disease. Flu is a severe disease, certainly for the more advanced world. Flu is a major source of death, excess death. But the fact is we don't close down the country when there's flu. And I think that we need to find a way to basically make what's happening more palatable. I don't actually know the population of Victoria. Could you tell me what that is?
Yeah, I think the population of Victoria is around 6 million, I believe.
Okay, right. So basically, you've had about 600 deaths so far out of 6 million. So you're about 100 deaths per million. So if you think about what we've seen in Europe, and it doesn't have to be the same everywhere, but we generally, countries, Western-like countries, Australia is not in the West, but countries that have, a relatively high standard of living, which means they have old people, it looks to me like in order to Australia to reach the sort of saturation that we've seen in Sweden or almost all the rest of the Western world, unfortunately, we're going to need to have more cases. We don't necessarily need to have more deaths, but unfortunately, it's impossible.
Isn't that the experience, Professor Levitt, from France, where deaths are cases, the infection rates going up higher and higher, but they haven't had deaths. Deaths are extremely low.
Exactly. The whole of Europe, there's been almost no increase in deaths.
Surely, Professor, that's the point, that if we're not seeing deaths, if we're not seeing excess deaths, then what is the point of, for example, in Victoria, we have the police hauling women out of cars, we have pregnant women being hounded in their homes by police officers charging in because they posted something on Facebook. Do you think there's a danger that there's an overreaction occurring in Melbourne, which bears no resemblance to the data or the experiences from around the world?
I would be interested very much in knowing what the excess deaths are. And the reason is that you're in your winter and you still have a flu season. And, maybe some of the people who are dying die of flu and COVID.
Well, the interesting thing, Professor, is apparently up till the end of July, deaths in nursing homes in Australia are 1,000 lower than last year.
Yeah. And the thing about, unfortunately, and again, this is very, very sad, we don't live forever. And as people get older, they become more frail, they have comorbidities. And, in Europe, for example, one of the reasons why there's a belief that COVID was relatively bad in Europe is that they had very, very weak flu seasons, both in the winter of 1920 and also in the winter of 1819. The flu was much less bad than normal. So one way to see this, and my analogy is not humane, but it's what I think is an easy thing to understand, is you could imagine a forest where there are some trees that are getting old, getting vulnerable, and then, for a few years there's no wind or no fire, and then suddenly there's a big wind and you're going to have a lot of trees fall down at first. You have a vulnerable population, generally an older population, a population with comorbidities. But I think the general misnomer is that we think we can control this virus, by strong action. And unfortunately, what we need to really do is control the panic, try to minimize the reaction. So, for example, in a very strange way, Australia is not unique in this. Other countries are also have lockdown. We now see that lockdown itself causes damage, if not in deaths, but in the fabric of society, children missing school, etc., police acting perhaps a little bit too assertively.
Exactly. Professor Levitt, unfortunately we've got to leave it there, but you raised some fascinating points, and absolutely, I think you've put your finger on it with political correctness and all that has led to. Thanks so much for talking to us on Outsiders and talking to Australia today. Thank you, Professor.
Good luck with your epidemic. Bye-bye.